Colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, a body endowed with reason. It is naked violence and only gives in when confronted with greater violence. This quote from Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth begins chapter 26 of Babel, or The Necessity of Violence, an arcane history of the Oxford Translators' Revolution. It entirely solidifies any themes that were perhaps ambivalent to the reader before. To any that are unaware of Frantz Fanon, to evoke his texts and beliefs in this way is to side with violent revolution, which in this book R.F. Kuang does wholly. I'm a socialist, admittedly a pretty bad one, a lazy one that doesn't do enough to read the economic texts. I don't like reading the long, exhaustive texts. They bore me. They need my unyielding entire attention because, they're boring. And I feel like my socialism comes from a place of empathy and first-hand witness. Yeah, I do think that not being that model pupil of Castro's philosophy that socialists should always be learning is a bad thing. I think if you're able to, you should commit to reading the economic theory if you are a socialist. I think to the point I understood this book, I would say I left with the arrogant belief that I understood it more than most people did, which I think is a damn shame. I'm going to spoil everything in this book from this point on, plus I won't be explaining the plot of the book either, but I'll leave a video of somebody else explaining the plot. But I'm going to spoil everything, so if you don't know what's going on, I'm not going to make it easy for you to understand. But I would love it if you could watch this video. Watching and reading other people's reviews of Babel really left me with the opinion that everyone should be afforded a voice, yet not everyone's voice is equal, because not everyone knows the same amount about what they're talking about. Every review I see confuses me, because I feel like they did not read what I did, and not in this means more to me than it does to you, or I'm saying this purely because I like the book more than you. Dislike and disengagement, at least to me, are separate things in relation to this book. They'll talk about how this changed their life, but in the most ridiculous non-revolutionary way. But I read this book and was in such a headspace that I felt like I should go to a Just Stop Oil meeting. I see people talk about the magic system with great seriousness, the book's lack of characterization, how readers felt it either was or wasn't like The Secret History, and how they felt R.F. Kuang tells and doesn't show. Even the positive reviews of this book perplex me. The focus on misogyny, which is important more than the emphasis this book puts on empire, a relish for the passion for Oxford and learning by your characters, all whilst disregarding the ideas of revolutionary violence that is prevalent here. Not that these aren't positive things a reader shouldn't take from the book, especially in regard to the detail of research about language that is meticulously added within, yet to see the majority of reviews for this book be about these smaller things and not revolution is interesting, especially when the majority of reviews are from white people. When I look up reviews of Babel, regardless of whether the person is giving a good or bad review of the book, the type of people that actually engage with the idea of violent revolution are mainly people of colour. It's fascinating because I see reviews from lots of people about this book claiming it insists upon itself, yet many have not gone to the extent of understanding and discussing an overarching theme in this book. In their long reviews they took time to film or write. It feels like she insists upon herself because she is. It feels like a history because it is. You as a reader are meant to pick that up. It's called an arcane history. It's someone, a future scholar in this world probably, adding to Robin's story, and therefore it feels more reminiscent of creative non-fiction. In insisting in a Sally Rooney-esque way about the world, she tells us a very clear message of how people should be reacting, yet people don't get it. She's showing, sure, but she is mainly telling. I agree with that. I agree with people's realization that there is a younger style of voice. However, I see it as new adult instead of young adult. This, I think, helps to thoroughly get points across. Honestly, yes, I don't think you're meant to side with anyone but her opinions in this book, which are watered down for a general audience through a younger, naiver narration, which is slowly fed to the reader by the way Robin interacts with revolution. So she's telling, but I don't think the readers are actually listening. Perhaps the type of people who are reading this book expect a different kind of book. Maybe they aren't the type to be insisted upon like literary fiction writers, like those who do take up the majority of Sally Rooney's insisting. In Babel, additions like footnotes show the reader how exacting the words are meant to be, because the footnotes act as dual narration between Robin's perspective and the future historian. Footnotes help with pacing to quickly update a reader about the world. They are squirrely asides to the story that fulfill maximalist tendencies and provide extra information due to the limited nature of Robin as a narrator. People really dislike the footnotes, but I think this simply adds to the idea, at least to me, that people really adhere to one type of writing structure and veering away from it is confusing to some. They'd rather strike it down rather than consider perhaps there's a reason for this. Maybe this way works too. Whilst this book doesn't decolonize literature or anything, it touches upon new structures of how works can be written, which helps to normalize decolonizing Western structures of literature for later. Structurally, something like this is found in non-fiction, and it is here in fiction. And being able to see the merits in this, whether there is a personal distaste for it, shows an ability to understand that literature and writing in general should be allowed to evolve. If the author believes it's needed, then footnotes should be allowed for any reason. This doesn't mean someone trying anything out should be without criticism, but readers should be trying to see why something is written in a way that is varied to the norm, whether it be a childish or pretentious decision by the author, or for a deliberate measured response to Western canonical structure. We are meant to hear her here meaning both R.F. Kuang and the fictional author she imposes into the book as, who is writing her opinions on the world within this book. This voice being someone that looks with hindsight and covers Robin's oversight in matters of the world. This is made clearer, I think, in the audiobook format, where the footnotes are narrated by a different voice actor. In its own way, it's also incredibly rare to see someone with such a revolutionary voice be able to insist upon their own political views like this in a fictional setting. Books are the only real place where you can do this because of the way the medium functions in comparison to others. Film and TV have studios with financial backing, from tens to hundreds of people working on them who are all invested in monetary return, so will not be promoting ideals that could possibly hurt their investors or investments. Whereas books touch less people before publication, publishing houses like HarperCollins can publish hundreds of books each year, one forgotten or not, there's much more leeway on how radical a book can be. Therefore, this book, whilst still needing to be edited for mainstream consumption, it can be more open about its own political stances. Recent Marvel productions such as Falcon and the Winter Soldier or Wakanda Forever use characters like Robin, Griffin and Rami as their villains instead of their protagonists, even when these villains have some legitimate political grievances. It shows how much more leeway is given here, and in a world where this is the most mainstream of media, does it not make sense that these radical opinions have to impose and insist within a book to make a difference? It will always be easier for me to grasp this and not question the revolution than for a liberal or not politically engaged reader. I already hold her beliefs. She doesn't need to win me over. Marx did that for her. A reader will always want the protagonist revolution to win. We are them for the course of the book. Yet, when she asks you to side with the characters that are harming people that are not harming them, are you willing to rationalize that desperation that evokes this? Especially since when rifling through hundreds of reviews, most readers are searching for the hedonism of quote-unquote normal dark academia, which seems more important than sitting with an invigorating personal thought about revolutionary violence, which is interesting as readers seem to continue to romanticize the ideas the genre of dark academia consistently criticizes: the overworking, stress, hierarchies, feeling of personal superiority. Sure, they might be searching books that critique these, but if that were true, why are the text posts about this on Tumblr that really created this genre and movement about this genre so intrigued by the worst of it? Let us be honest with ourselves for a moment. The overworking, stress, hierarchies, feeling of personal superiority. Sure, they might be searching for books that critique these, but if that were true, why are the text posts on Tumblr, things that really started the dark academia movement, why were they so intrigued by the worst of it? Let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. Why do we really like this genre? Perhaps if we look at the main demographic that reads this genre, we can get a hint. Not that it's a problem that it's mainly white people, it makes sense since the genre itself is mainly about white characters and their problems, but an inability to see beyond the genre when the themes are altered from the normal stories of dark academia, when dark academia turns its eyes on stories of people of colour and decides to depict those stories. It is unsettling to me to see so many people read the story and not see that the major theme of the story is the certainty of violence for revolutionary gain, and that it seems the only way to gain any ground against oppressive forces. Not that everyone didn't get this, some definitely did. Some probably sided with the revolution the way you side with any revolutionary protagonist. Thomas from the Maze Runner is overthrowing the government, and I trust him because he's the main character. But fewer, I think, saw this book as wider than that. Not that you absolutely need to, since this is simply fiction, but it's unsettling still because the main ideas don't register to most people, even when the book is written with a sense of contemporary urgency, even when the novel itself is set in the past. Academia, in actuality, is a place of power withholding the spread of information. This in Babel is seen through who can study there. rich white men or bodies of colour which are useful to the empire simply because of their academic labour, which no one else is able to give to the empire. In the real world, this kind of manifests as the globalized economy of low wages and outsourcing Western goods. Only lower economically developed countries can provide goods at lower prices for rich Western customers, even at the risk of the workers' lives in the East. Why they can study? They study so they can maintain the balance of silver work within the empire and make sure it runs smoothly, especially as the work becomes too tricky to still run as well with Western English minds and skills where Eastern students are still able to carry out these tasks and even innovate their work to work better for the West at their own expense because they are so far removed from the actual use of silver in Babel. By setting silver work as projects and learning instead of a weapon of control, the academics which control the silver no longer see the initial use and problematic aspects of their work as they are so closely intertwined with it under the guise of academia. This can be seen through the way a lot of people work for weapons companies just for money in the real world. What they can study. They study what is important to the empire, and when they want to uncover their own languages and personal interests, they are not aided and instead are geared towards projects that sustain colonial power. Even seen through how they study. They are taught through lectures and tutorials where they are told things. They are told to do their own research, but how far do the resources set by and confined within a white supremacist institution really allow for learning about the world as it is and not how the empire wants it to be seen? And where they study at the heart of Babel's world of empirical control through silver at Oxford or wherever the university deems fit for them to go and send for placement in aid of the empirical agenda, thereby emphasising that studying at Oxford only fosters an environment that creates and maintains status quo. The biggest problem is the empire. It is what controls academic interest and therefore what the silver will be used for. The criticism here doesn't stop with academia. A lot of dark academia underlines the idea that academia is corrupt, and whilst understanding that it is systemic social problems like class or gender that generally create them, specifically these two because most dark academia is based on white people, but never really beyond that. Babel's entire plotline is not to write against simply academia, but also the empire's control. Babel's world makes it easier to fight the empire because silver is so important, and it takes the role of industrialized globalization. It reaches past the critiques of dark academia. When it comes to silver working and the magic system, there is a sweetness of magic, because it makes the concept of what the empire fights to protect more tangible. Commerce, political ideals, and economic trade are harder to explain cleanly. Again, I'm not a smart socialist, but this basically ends up being within the context of Babel. Oxford controls silver, which controls industrialization. The empire runs the merchants who trade with the industrialists, who buy material to create goods and service which garner money that is then used to pay for workers who power industrialization through innovation and labour. Here, the innovation is simply through the silver as well. People don't like silver-based magic, and perhaps if a reader was expecting a much more immersive and expansive magic system, then it makes sense to be let down. But if not, the magic serves to act in this as an allegory, to show a simple way of the capitalistic process, but also embody the importance of transferring languages. To not like it is fine. To say that it doesn't make sense is to nitpick rather than understand the revolutionary message behind the book itself. Wanting to be right isn't impressive if you're not willing to engage. Problems of class, race, and gender in academia are obviously linked to the whole of society and not simply academia. So there is a change of themes and idea when the idea of opium is introduced to the story. The book is no longer simply criticizing the workings of academia, but the empire at large as supported by academia. The book does belong under the umbrella of dark academia. It takes from R.F. Kuang's own workings under academia, but I think it also works mainly from a marketing perspective. But here, silver takes the corruption beyond Oxford, so it does not simply remain fixed within the genre. Academia and control in the real world come from how curriculums are built to hide and shield you from the truth, so no one learns about revolt and the abhorrence of life, i.e. things like colonialism in British history lessons. The real-life practicality of how academia controls politics is through think tanks, surveys, papers and studies that skew a certain way due to the person who writes it. Skewed papers then being used to justify jurisdiction and law instead of the way academia, by the way of silver in Babel, directly affects the world. It is criticising dark academia, but a fake version of academia that is entangled with the wider scope of the world in different ways that academia is in real life. Because whilst this is different to the reality, academia does play a part in maintaining inequality. Interpersonal relationships in Babel relate to society as a whole, because whilst people would like to forget this, living in any society is political. These relationships help to decipher personal and individual levels of oppression and how that affects the collective. The character of Letty is important mainly because many characters like her don't exist. We see archetypes of these things pop up, Karens or phrases like white women tears, yet their widespread usage and memification make them less impactful. It draws away from the problem that white women pose by using their privilege and infantilization as a weapon against other more marginalized communities through a lack of awareness and or a want of this awareness of intersectionality. It is mesmerizing to see white women not as the most offended. R.F. Kuang herself said in many works of Victorian fiction or works set in this period, women are written as the belittled and oppressed without consideration of other identities. Letty's portrayal also serves to speak on how there are many white women in stories who are heralded as revolutionary figures in their worlds. Katniss, Triss are put into scenarios where they get to be heroes that saved the world. Yet in the real world, these women aren't heading revolutionary action. It is usually people of colour. And further, when women of colour try to enact radical change and do not simply speak on the matter and become subsumed into the institution, like people like Malala, it means death for them. Letty is not a saviour, she's not one of the good ones. We should not be letting her behaviour slide because she doesn't know better, because as we see in Babel itself, this behaviour causes larger issues. And whilst revolutionaries in dystopian revolutionary stories still die, a la Triss of Glenvin, they get to be in popular stories of revolution where they stand out in the real world. In English classes, especially my own, we are told over and over again, Margaret Atwood wrote Handmaid's Tale as a speculative fiction. All the oppressive acts that occur have happened in the real world. They don't really try to add on the fact that these awful actions happen to people of colour, specifically women of colour. When they happened to women of colour in the real world, people didn't care. But suddenly when repackaged into a world really not that off-kilter to our own, through the eyes and body of a white woman, now the story is a classic, a bestseller, and part of the modern canon. Which makes the ending here refreshing. Firstly, Victoire, a black woman surviving as an act of revolutionary defiance, is definitely a purposeful ending. Her name even literally means victory. She refuses to be the example. She refuses to die because endurance is resistance in itself. And she doesn't want to be remembered or have martyrdom. She wants to live. She explores a pursuit to help others and find a way to be happy in a world that has not offered this to her. Secondly, there's criticism towards the character development, that people can't really engage and feel sympathy for all the horrid plot points if they don't feel bad for Robin. This is an honest-to-God thing that I saw someone say. I think neoliberalism is going to kill us if we don't kill it first. Yet, in reality, assigning a pretty blank slate reserved character that isn't the flag-waving revolutionary to rally behind rationalizes the reality of activism. It is not one movement. Activism is much more effective in its form currently as decentralized grassroots movements and mutual aid projects. It is not the one white woman to save the day story. It is the hard work of individuals. Demolishing this archetype of a brilliant blazing saviour is, whilst maybe to you a waiting faux pas, to not entirely develop Robin's character, but to this story is a feature of realism. The book employs the common trope of killing the most knowledgeable, the one that could have done the most in a situation. From the moment Griffin is introduced, it feels like he's a lamb to the slaughter. His confident and steadfast presence in the face of violent revolution would have been more grounded and inspiring to the students left in the tower. In killing him, she again kills this idea of a revolutionary figurehead, but also a sense of hope behind having someone idealistic and at least outwardly competent in a way Robin is not. This could also be said for killing Rami, a much more outspoken and confident character in terms of being anti-establishment and generally someone with more authentic charisma. It gives the masses the thought that the normal people, the scared, the proletariat, might have to be the ones that make sacrifices themselves because the boldest of us might not be around forever. Regardless, Robin's arc is fascinating. Robin starts as an indoctrinated Chinese boy, happy to exploit the spoils of Oxford. Yet, in seeing the harm of the empire, slowly pushes forward with the idea of turning against it. He even gives up on revolution until he realizes his friends are in trouble, and then only slowly comes to terms with violent revolution. He doesn't want the gun that Griffin gives him. He feels bad for killing Lovell in a way Griffin wouldn't. And then when he sees negotiation with the Empire without violence and threat doesn't make the Empire see opposition at all, his actions become impulsive and reactionary. But this makes him feel like a person. When he decides on violence, he does indeed go further into violence quicker. But there is a reality here. He's not an academic discovering violent revolution. He's living it. And in a more realistic light, when you realise you believe in violent revolution, you really do start to believe in it quickly and fiercely as you begin to see past the haze in a way a character like Professor Chakravarti can't. There is no other way, so we must administer violence forcefully and thoughtfully, which is what Robin eventually decides. In the real world, this kind of becomes things like violent protest. It doesn't have to mean arms immediately. Robin's character shows that there is no way to mould a person of colour into the perfect British subject without erasing their heritage. Yet without their heritage, the ideas of Britishness do not work. In Babel, that is through his connection to Mandarin. They need his childhood connection to make silver work. In our world, the widespread propaganda of race superiority and that some are better than others at being workers. The West needs the East to be oppositions so that they can rationalise why oppression is necessary. The book is not simply about people, but also about white supremacist systems. The book serves as a purpose closer to something like Brave New World than Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell or Ninth House. I'm not wholeheartedly saying that we can't criticise this book, but when criticising, I'd like to see people actually engaging with the wider ideas first, especially since some of the problems I see are directly led by people being unable to understand that the theme of the book is the reason why a certain thing happens within the book. Because engaging with the discourse and disliking it, at least regarding the theme in the first place, should be necessary. An issue I have is that every single previously named person of colour is on Hermes' side, which seems wholly inaccurate and unrealistic, as if we had such POC solidarity, we would have less problems today. We're still fighting against affirmative action like dickheads. We aren't standing together anytime soon. Sure, in a world like Oxford, where many of them were raised the same and endured some of the same types of racism, they could be more inclined to side with the revolutionaries. But all the ones that we know seems excessive. And sure, some of the unnamed ones leave, but the memorable ones are all good. In a world where these students are indoctrinated into a life of privilege and have been torn from their ties to their homelands, aside from their language, it seems strange to think that this could happen. On the flip side, I did like that only one white person did try to stay and help. At this time, not many would have in a world ruled by white power. To side with the oppressed would need a wider perspective that most privileged white people don't have. Professor Croft, specifically, is an inspired choice because she represents who someone like Letty could have been. Someone who faced all the same discriminations as her, yet decided to stay and help. Decided to even die for the cause in a world where she, more than others, could have been spared by the system. My biggest issue, however, with the story is the ending. It's very open. Robin dies in his act of violence, and we never really see the consequences of this. The open ending leaves the message more ambiguous. Does violent revolution even work? It allows readers to continue to question, which is a strange choice in a book that doesn't really let the readers question until this point, because R.F. Kuang wants us to root for violence up until this point. His sacrifice is important enough that a historian has written about it, yet Victoire makes no reference to its failing or success. Perhaps that is because it is pretty clear that if he blows up Babel, there would definitely be consequences, so we should take this act of his decision to mean that there has been disruption administered. But we don't see the impact of this choice on the war in China, which was the point of the action at all. Obviously, the choice to end the book comes from the same principle most stories about revolution have, which is that we don't know what can actually happen. We succeed in revolution, will the positive outcomes we wanted from this actually come to fruition? Something I've always wanted to know is what happens to Panem after the rebels win? What system is put in place? Even most speculative leftist fiction doesn't discuss the direct aftermath of revolution, but an unknown far-off future. Babel, by destroying a large portion of England's silver connections, we wonder how does this actually impact the British Empire? Should it not change things? But we will never know. I've always wanted to see the boldness of seeing what happens after the quote-unquote good guys win. What world would they actually build? Sanderson in Well of Ascension kind of does this, and he doesn't after Hero of Ages, which is the actual ending to the first Mistborn trilogy, which is interesting. The book refuses us the relief of knowing what happens, imbuing us with a sense of reality through fear, because really what is the point of it all if we can't be sure of the positive consequences, which I guess is the question many readers decide not to grapple with when reading this book. There is no definitive answer here like everywhere else in the book. Therefore, when the reader is made to infer the message R.F. Kuang has been slamming into our heads the whole book, a reader can decide to gloss over it because it's not as polished as the rest of R.F. Kuang's messages. I can't entirely blame Kuang for people's lack of attention or care for violent revolution, but I do think it's fascinatingly strange to drop the ball on shaping public opinion and telling the audience, here. Babel is merely a fictional book. It's not an instructional manual on revolution, and I don't want anyone to think that I think that. But I do think there's a glaring problem with people not seeing what the book is trying to tell them with glaring clarity and then turning to the internet and saying the glaring clarity feels stifling and they want to be able to think about it more, when the clarity actually seems to be quite opaque to some readers. The main reason I say this without feeling like I'm judging readers and reviewers too harshly is because I watched a video of someone interview R.F. Kuang asking her why she thought it was important to depict violence as the way to fight against the regime rather than something like peaceful protest. I feel like it's wildly insane to have the author of a book in front of you and ask them a question that is answered within the text. The whole book is about answering this question. Violence is because nothing else works. And she not just showing you this, she tells you this. And these were very genuine, respectful, non-white hosts. And if they don't get it, I don't think the people who gloss over and turn a blind eye about the matter are thinking about the importance of the book advocating for violent revolution at all. And these were genuine, respectful, non-white hosts. And if even they don't get it, I don't think people who gloss over and are willing to turn a blind eye about the matter are thinking about the importance of the book advocating for violent revolution at all. Overall, I don't think this video is super cohesive. I think, if anything, it comes off as a mild-mannered rant against white people simply not getting it, but it's really not just white people, it's very much any neoliberal who sticks by status quo. And I think of any Babel video, I think this may be, if you can mind my arrogance, necessary just simply in the name of, it's weird to see this and read this book and not see that the book advocates violent revolution in the fight against oppression and for global rights, or to see that and to minimize the fact that that is the real message of the book, is to kind of do a disservice to this book. People who look at the world and character building cannot see that they are kind of carved purposefully to display this idea, are in many ways looking at this book unfairly and without analysis. And if you can't see this, even though you do have a right to criticize it, I think you need to reevaluate whether or not your review as it is right now makes sense or even is important to be given. Well, my review doesn't need to be important. It's simply my opinion. Especially if you're a bigger creator and you come away from this book believing in this kind of individualism, you're simply proving my point. I'm not saying you didn't understand this book, but you didn't take from it what you perhaps should have.